Also, there's available reconciliation of the two wisdoms, Jami al-Hikmatain, as well on a somewhat lower key as Book of Enlightenment, which is known as Shish al-Fasl, and Book of Felicity, and many different smaller books. Some there's questions about, but there's many things you can find that he talks about. The philosophical brotherhood of the Basra, the Ikhwan al-Safa, for instance, and many Shia and pre-Alamuti Ismaili ideas, which were new to him, because that's not where he was coming from. He was coming from a Sunni background. He, in the second or the ethical section of his poem, he talks about moral maxims, thoughts on man's good and bad qualities, on the necessity of shunning the company of fools and double-faced friends, the deceptive allurements of the world, and the secret snares of ambitious men who crave rank and wealth. He writes about everything, really, in the world. It's a big book. And it concludes with an imaginary vision of a beautiful work of spirits who have stripped off the fetters of earthly cares and sorrows and revel in the pure light of divine wisdom and love, which of course is, which I'll speak about later, the object of the Fatimid thought. But in general, I won't be referring, except in passing, to any of these works, but pay more attention to another work of his, which is the Diwan, which is composed in his latter days and contains most of his lyrical poetry. And the chief topics of these are the enthusiastic praise of Ali alayhi salam and the descendants alayhum salam of Ali alayhi salam, and in particular the 8th Fatimi Imam المستنصربالله alayhi salam, who he actually met in Cairo. And mind you, the Ismailis are not like the Ithnashri. Ithnashri, the whole thing comes to a relative end with the 12th Imam, who's in seclusion. So they don't have an Imam. They don't have anybody to go. They're in the same place actually as the Sunnis are, except later on, in a certain way. But these people have an Imam. In other words, the people who followed from Jafar Sadiq and Ismail and Muhammad have still a living Imam. Not maybe still after the post-Alamuti period, not so clear, but in that time, in the time of the Fatimids, they definitely had an Imam who they could talk to, and I'll go into some of that in this talk as well. And their ideal was to restore people to their original nature. As I said before, خَلَقَ الْإِنسَانَ فِي أَحْسَنِ تَقْوِيمٍ. Allah says, I created the human in the best of forms. ثُمَّ رَدَدْنَاهُ أَسْفَلَ سَافِلِينَ. Then he descended into the worst of forms. But he was once in the best of forms. So the object of all of the work of the Fatimiyun was to restore people to their original form. This is when we say the Eid al-Fitra, we're talking about Fitra, yani the real being as the human being is created. Everybody created in the form of the Fitra. That was their object, to return people to their original nature, whatever they were. They didn't care what you were, they didn't care who you were, anything about that. What we were interested in is, how can we return you to who you were when you were born? And this man, that Imam Mustansir-Billah, he was the Imam for 60 years, and so he had a long time to work on this project. Indeed, that is the longest of all the Khulafa in the Muslim world, either in Egypt or elsewhere in any of the other Islamic states. And his Bab, or his gate, as Ali was the Bab of Muhammad ﷺ, was Muayyad Fidin al-Shirazi, who was the teacher of Nasr al-Khusro. And this man was called the Da'iyat Mutlaq, or the unrestricted caller, or Bab al-Abwab, the gate of gates, or Da'i Duwat, the chief caller, etc. That's who he was. That's the teacher. That's the man who brought him to the Fatimi way of thinking, was this man, Muayyid Fiddin al-Shirazi, Qaddasallahu Sirruhu. In his theological and in his philosophical writings, he brought the spiritual heritage of the Fatimid to its pinnacle. And in this position, he worked inside the house of knowledge, Dar al-Ilm or Dar al-Hikmah, teaching the dua, the missionaries, the da'is, from both inside and outside the Fatimid lands, and we'll talk more about that because there were 12 of these lands, composing the theological works until the end of his life in 1078. And this diwan, which is a compilation in poetic form of many of these ideas, contains passionate outcries against the duplicities and deceptions of Khorasan, which is his homeland, and its rulers, who wound up, when he came back to his home, driving him from his home, and sometimes his deep despondency in seeing himself despised by his former associates, excluded, ostracized, anathematized as a dog, as an exile, and forbidden from all participation in the interplay of scholars and teachers in the Sunni world that existed in the state of Khorasan. They didn't want to hear from him. No, they didn't want to hear from him, they wanted to get rid of him. They did get rid of him. They drove him and drove him and drove him until they drove him out into this, like they did with the Prophet ﷺ, into this little valley called Badakhshan, a very, very remote part of the world, because they didn't want to hear it, what he had to say. Scattered through all of these outbursts of hope and despair, there are lessons of morality, warnings against the tricks and the perfidies of the world, against the vanity of earthly splendors and greatness, against the folly and injustice of men, against hypocrisy, frivolity, viciousness, the viciousness especially of fashionable society, and that of government courts in particular. The Diwan includes many lyrical and beautiful passages as well, which explores his love of the quiet solitude of his final place of exile and his place of burial in Yangan, in Badakhshan, where he taught under the protection of the ruler of that province in the very last years of his life, and brought many people to an understanding of the teachings of the Fatimids, and as were conveyed to him by his teacher, Muayyid Fiddin al-Shirazi. I first came into contact with this diwan in an edition of the Imperial Iranian Academy of Philosophy, translated by Ghulam Reza Avani and Peter Lamborn Wilson, who you may know as Hakim Bey, when the latter was a student of Sayyid Nasr's in the late 60s and early 70s of the last century. And this marked the first time I read, and it was in a truncated and highly edited version of the Qasida Itrafi of Nasr al-Khusro. At the time, when I read it, I must confess that it went in one eye and out the other. But one phrase really deeply registered, I remember till today, when he was speaking about his sheikh, he wrote, I stood before you, quote, I stood before you, pale and skeletal, clad in a woolen cloak, and I kissed your hand. I kissed your hand as if it were the grave of the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam.